had just recently, a couple of days ago, 27th of January, International Memorial Day for Holocaust. I have some concern about the politics of the memory of the Holocaust. Now, I will talk today about how important it is for us, human civilization, to learn from history. We, human society, are moving through the times. So imagine when we walk outside, walking just some street, and we look forward and we walk. We see the way, and accordingly we adjust our movements and direction. But if we think about this in terms of how we move through the times, then the picture will look actually different. And so now if we look at this in this way, we understand that we can plan and avoid some obstacles as much as possible only if we learn from the history best possible. We are moving indeed backwards. It is very important to think about how is history recording, how does it work, and how genuine is it being brought to the next generation. If we look at the history of the Jewish nation, we can see oppression began about 2,000 years ago. This is when the Roman Empire drove the Jewish nation from its land. The ongoing oppression, the final stage of it, ended up in being a Holocaust, attempt to exterminate the whole nation, just because somebody was born Jewish or followed the Jewish religion. There are many books written about the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. Different theories are being discussed and presented. The reason for anti-Semitism, the phenomenon itself, I would condense into two main pillars which it is based on. So one pillar is that after Christianity came up from based on Jewish religion, then it became two competing religions, like two competing franchises, if you want, McDonald's and Burger King. And so it is natural. There is a motivation, possibly from both sides, to view as being the one which is right one. And so this is a competition of two approaches, two religions. And each side thinks it is right. So the usual human competition for resources and ideas. The second pillar of anti-Semitism is the fact that the Jewish nation did lose its land, its homeland, if you want. And that led to the fact that the nation was just helpless. And I'm giving here an example. Saddam Hussein developed some gas weapons, and he had the great idea to check it out, how it works on somebody. And so he has used this on a village in Iraq. He just bombed the village and several thousand people died. So the question is, which people did he choose to use these weapons? And he could have chosen any nation of his own Iraqis, because there live Afghans and Iranians and obviously Iraqis and other nations. He has chosen to use it on the Kurds. So you use this on a Kurdish village. So the question is, why on Kurds? Why not on Turks, who also may live in Iraq, or Iranians? Because the Iranians and the Turks, they have their own nation. They have a Turkey or Iran. And if he would apply this, gas those people from these countries, guess what would happen? Those countries would get him a clear message, maybe even a war, because of this. Several thousand people died. By the way, it's the biggest nation without their own land. Almost 40 million Kurds don't have their own land. But this example shows that once a nation loses its homeland, it loses its protection. And today we Jews, wherever we live, in US, in Europe, in Russia, does not matter where. There may be some anti-Semitic incidents, which happens. We understand the world is not perfect, and we Jews maybe also don't like somebody which is not correct, and it is more on individual level. But fact is that wherever the Jews live, they know there is a strong Israel which can protect it. Or at least they can go back if they are not liked in a specific country anymore. We know many nations which disappeared over the years of history because they lost their land. So the Holocaust, which hit the Jews and was almost successful, I may remind here that genocide during World War II was also planned on the nations of Soviet Union. This is being maybe not as shown in the Western countries, but Hitler's offensive against Soviet Union was based on the idea that the Slavs are a race which is less valuable than the Aryans, and there was a clear-cut goal to basically exterminate most of the nations of Soviet Union, to enslave them. I would like also to mention that Japan invaded China almost 10 years before the official World War II began in 1933, and almost 30 million Chinese people were murdered, brutally murdered by Japanese, which is or can be assumed as an attempt, at least, of genocide, is a result of competing nations for resources, for power. And the idea of the Memorial Day of Holocaust, to not forget, is important not only for the Jews. This is my point. It is important for our civilizations to understand that humans are able to do such things if specific conditions occur, and the memory of Holocaust, and also the understanding why it happened, which circumstances were contributing to occurring of a Holocaust in general. This is very important. It is absolutely crucial that we are doing our best possible effort to record the history, the events which may be yesterday or 10 or 20 years ago, as objectively as possible, so the future generations can analyze and understand. I would like to see this whole conversation today as a trigger for everybody who listens about this to go deeper if it's interesting, and to find more sources, different sources, not just one source. And one will see in a second why it is important to look at different sources, so we really understand what is going on. How was Holocaust differently reported by the West? One big part of history of Holocaust is what the influence of the United States of America. USA had a much bigger role in helping, maybe even triggering the Holocaust than it is taught today in West. I would like to get here an idea how I do see what happened last century, which brought the Holocaust at the end to be almost fulfilled by Hitler. There was a movement triggered by Darwin's evolution theory, and based on this, social Darwinism occurred. Social Darwinism presumes that, similar like to animals, the human races are competing with each other. The academic idea was, since they are different races, they have different properties possibly, they are black and white, and maybe tall and short, and strong and weak, and so they all compete for the resources, and the best race shall win. This was the very primary idea of the social Darwinism. The social Darwinism was picked up by the academic society in various countries and also in US. Almost half of US states, there were concentration camps where presumably less valuable races were assembled, and they began to practice euthanasia and forced divorce and sterilization. Anti-Semitism, especially in the early decade of the 20th century, was very common in the United States. There was a eugenic society. Eugenics means the proper genetics. They have invented or introduced the archery. It was not in Germany, it was in US. Henry Ford, the very famous car builder, he became one specific person, did probably the biggest dissemination, so distribution of anti-Semitic feelings and ideas in the world, purchased a newspaper to publish every week a very anti-Semitic pamphlet, and it came so far that each car which Henry Ford sold had this anti-Semitic pamphlet. So, fact is, therefore, anti-Semitism was widely prevalent in US. And now we have to go a little further, deeper in the geopolitics. At the beginning of the 20th century, the superpower was the United Kingdom, because it was able to control the sea, the tradeways over the sea. Once the industrialization hit also the European continent, bureaucrats in London, they figured out that Germany has basically already overtaken the production output of England. And so they were scared that Germany may join Russia, which has resources, endless resources, obviously. And first of all, it would be a very strong power, number one. And number two, even more important, it would be a continental power. It would become, like, as they called it, the big land, which ruled out for England to control the tradeways. Ultimately, United Kingdom would lose its position as a global world leader. And based on these assumptions, there was drawn up a plan to antagonize Germany and Russia, so to let them clash, if you want, in a war, ideally, which happened then, and to weaken them and to disable, to make it impossible them to unite. Yes, two countries became highly antagonized. One became right radicals, Nazis. The other one became communistic, and in a communistic revolution where the Tsar in 1917 was removed from power. And at the end, this plan was successful. Germany was driven step by step towards Russia, then Soviet Union. War is not plannable. In fact, such war, it happened, but it didn't end up being that what the United Kingdom wished for, because at the end they lost their position to another country, the United States. The point is here, most important is that Hitler, when he came to power, he was brought to power indeed, conjured to power by United Kingdom and USA. Two books which I highly recommend Nazi nexus, and Conjuring Hitler, how United Kingdom and America made the Third Reich. Obviously there are more books to it, but once you read those two books, it will give you possibly another perspective. Hitler was sufficiently helped to get in power and to develop then after his deeds by United Kingdom and US. In wide circles in academia and also in politics, Hitler's anti-Semitic ideas were warm welcome. In fact, Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, is based on the book of the Eugenic Society, which was written in the 20s. The book Nazi Nexus from Edwin Black. He himself is a son of two concentration camp survivors, so from Holocaust survivors, from Jewish family. Edwin Black, his original name is actually Edwin Schwarz, which is in German Black, so it was translated into English. So he did a very, profound research, and he found things like, for example, when Hitler came to power, IBM, International Business Machinery, approached Hitler and offered to help him to identify, to organize the mass murder of Jews. This was in 1933. And they used Perfocat machine, and all the numbers, the tattoos of the Holocaust survivors are based on this technology. Basically, it is machine-based computers, which enabled Hitler, first of all, to identify where the Jews were living, because of censuses, because of banking system, where the IBM were monopole almost in this area. So they had the data to actually find the Jews. But it went even further. It's in this customized Perfocards, it was pre-planned where to find the Jews, where to gather them, how they will arrive in the concentration camps, how they're gonna die, either by working or by hunger. And so many positions were pre-planned in this Perfocards. So we understand that this was a consolidated, systematic approach. IBM did not sell those machines. They were always leased. And that means in each concentration camp, there were IBM employees who were running those machines for statistics. Another aspect of it is, always was the question how Hitler was able to transport all the millions of prisoners, even during wartime. This alone to organize, it's not an easy task. And as it came out, IBM helped to organize the logistics for the Deutsche Reichsbahn. This is the German railway system, which was, through this technology, enabled to transport during day the normal goods, and during night, so people don't know about this, they were transporting the prisoners. Another example, which is again based on facts, the Carnegie Foundation. This is one of the academics, as I have mentioned before, which was also supporting this eugenic society ideas. They have financed Mengele. This is the doctor, if you call it, who made bestialic experiments on Jewish twins. And the Carnegie Foundation, now in Pittsburgh, was financing Mengele and received for this his research results. This is one aspect of the Holocaust, and there are many more named in this book, which I highly recommend to read. My point here is we want to make everything possible to prevent this. For this, we need to learn this. Now, I know a person who has a major in a prominent US university in Holocaust history. And when I confronted him with these facts, which I have learned myself first time a couple of years ago from reading this book, he told me this is just not true, this cannot be. And obviously once he got this book in his hands and made further research, he came back to me and said, yes, you're right. This is really something I didn't know. And this is somebody who went here to study history major. So I brought this little example up, and there's much more to it, just to show that the history of Holocaust is by far not established, if you want, for the future generations in its full diversity. It is not to blame now the Americans who today living don't have anything to do with the deeds. Similar things happened in Soviet Union. There it was a different reason. When Soviet Union overcame Hitler Germany, they have gained some territory, and they have also taken control over some part of Eastern Europe. There was the communistic idea of spreading the communism, the socialism, the communism worldwide, which became after World War II maybe a little less than it was in the early revolutionary days. But the main point is, since the West, Germany, attacked Soviet Union, so Soviet Union after the war, they wanted to have like a buffer zone, and it makes sense that they have taken control over those territories. But in any case, the point is that in Holocaust, not only Germany was accomplice. Germany was the main driver, but we have to understand that anti-Semitism is nothing what Germany had invented. We have seen that anti-Semitism was in US, as in basically all other countries surrounding, in Europe especially. And so Holocaust and all deeds which are connected with this happened, you can say, almost without exception in all European nations. It happened in Poland, in Romania, in Baltic countries, Latvia, Litva, Estonia, and most of the countries which were occupied by Germans, they found sufficiently amount of anti-Semites and gave into pressure too easy, possibly, and have allowed the system to begin the genocide. But once the war was over, and those countries which were also accomplices in the Holocaust became under the influence of Soviet Union, the leaders did not want to brand them as being accomplices at the Holocaust. Many things which happened, also for example in Ukraine, because there were many Jews lived in Ukraine, and Babi Yar, so there were atrocities done. It was suppressed. This information was suppressed by Soviet Union, and then later on, when Israel became rather to the western part of the ideological movement, free economy, then it became also an ideological opponent, and even more gave the reason to not hang this above. So this is just an example how Holocaust was regarded in Soviet Union. And in this regards, I would like to point out that once the Soviet Union disintegrated and Russia is the main big country which is left, the approach and the teaching of Holocaust has changed dramatically. How Russia today also teaches Holocaust. They also obviously do not allow the memory of its own fallen. As I pointed out, almost 30 million people died, and approximately half of it were just civilians, children and women and all the elderly. and then obviously also the military. But in general, it is understood and emphasized in history lessons that the Holocaust on Jews was a specific event among several similar ones. Also in Israel, the memory of Holocaust is also to some degree portrayed not correctly. A couple of years ago, I went to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And I was not there before. So I was several times in Israel, but I felt that I know enough about Holocaust. Me personally, I did not want to go through this pain of seeing this. In 2015, I went to Moscow to celebrate Victory Day on May 9th. And they have built in Moscow a very strong, very fantastic, if you want, museum. It's called Museum of Tolerance. And it has the same topic. It's not just a Jewish topic, Jewish Holocaust. It is the topic of what atrocities and terrible historical events happened to be during World War II. And it has a very, very strong informational value. I went there, also the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, and in both occasions I found that the part of history concerning USA is not present there. And so I went with this book in Jerusalem to the Institute of Holocaust, which is right at the site of Yad Vashem, and I talked there to a researcher, and the lady I showed her the book, and she went with me. I went with her actually to a database which they have there, and in this database they have all sources available, serious sources available for study of Holocaust, which is the base obviously for the exhibition. And so she was wondering whether this book, which she did not know about, the facts I told you in brief like I did now, she never heard about that. And so she looked into this database, and indeed she found this book. The Holocaust Museum, the historians there know about these events. Still, they are not presented in the exhibition. And I know from this book that the US government has pressured a museum which is in Washington, the Holocaust Museum, to take out from the exhibition the IBM Perfocard machine. As I pointed out, why Soviet Union did not want to have at first this Holocaust history to be displayed and taught in its full extent, because some of the Eastern European countries were involved, and they didn't want to have this painful topic to be exposed. Same situation we have in US. We understand it is a bad history, and who likes bad history? And the same situation is in Israel. Because Israel is a small country, it needs support. America is one of the main supporter of safety, security of Israel. And I understand the political background of it, why there are sensitivities in order to have good relationship with America, for which it is very important, due to their own reason, to have this not discussed publicly. So we understand history is being bent. And again, why is it important for us to get after this? We have a situation where the current superpower USA is in change. The whole world is in change, and so the USA as a country, USA as a superpower, and the position of USA is going to change as well. We understand that. Nobody knows how fast and when it will be, but we understand that change is coming in any case. This is what history is about. USA, last, let's say, 30 years, especially after Soviet Union collapsed, and it became the only superpower in terms of military. Now, over the last, let's say, 5 years, has lost the ability to secure its superpower position by military force, by military projection. That there is change in face of Russia and China. China more economically, but in short future, surely also militarily. In some areas they have already overtaken the US, and Russia economically not as weak as often portrayed, still a very strong country, but based on its size and decisiveness of its population and upcoming strength, re-establishing its positions, and especially also in regards to development of new strategic and tactical weapons, they have obliterated the ability of US to, as easily as it was in the past, let's say, to project its power and to defend its position as a superpower and the main leader. And because of the situation, the United States and its Western allies are taking other means, tools in their hands to try to maintain this position. The US dollar as a currency is being used as a tool to sanction and to press countries to follow the policies of US. And then there is another very strong tool. This is the media, the informational control, to control the minds and the ideas of billions, we want to say, of people. And this approach, which is called the hybrid war, which includes the informational war, the financial war, all those tools, they are being used now to weaken its opponents. Among them is China and Russia, as I've pointed out. And specifically about Russia, what happened is in 2014, there was an election in Ukraine, and the elected president was ousted by opposition, which was supported by US through, it's called Orange Revolution, but the techniques are well established now, where the US administration, based on the informational power they have, are destabilizing the country at aim with protests and mass demonstrations, which often is successful and are able to drive even legally elected governments out of their position. This happens the first time, by the way, in Iran in 1953, where an elected minister president was ousted by the United Kingdom and US to enable more favorable trade of crude oil. The fact is that the elected government in Ukraine in 2014 was overturned, and a more radical nationalistic government was placed. And we have to understand that Ukraine, first of all, it is Russia, the Russian Empire began with Ukraine, with Kiev. Kiev was the first capital of Russia. I personally was born in Ukraine, and to be honest, I didn't learn Ukrainian at all. My father speaks Ukrainian because he lives in a small village. I lived in Odessa, and as a child, we left Soviet Union. I was a child, second class, second grade I just finished. Today, in Ukraine, 90% of language is Russian. It is basically the same nation. And yes, there were nationalists, ultra-nationalists even, who just recently were forbidden in Europe, and then they were brought to power, and since several years are conducting policies which are aimed to antagonize Ukraine against Russia, similar as it was done with Germany and Soviet Union or Russia 100 years ago. And now this is here my point. In Ukraine, now they have just recently introduced a law which disallows Russian to be spoken in public, in schools, in restaurants. They block the language. 80% of population speaks Russian. Probably more than half does not speak Ukrainian. And they are orchestrating witch hunts on people who just live there and speak their language. The Crimean Peninsula, and also as the West calls separatists, Donbass, LNR and DNR, they are called Donetsk, those regions which do not want to deal right now with Ukraine anything, the reason for their separation, the reason why the population of Crimea, which is just straight Russian, it is actually by mistake became Ukrainian after Soviet Union broke down. But it doesn't matter, they could have lived in Ukraine as well. But in the moment where those radicals came to power, they immediately announced that they want to block the Russian language. It looks like other problems they did not have. And how would today, let's say Texas, react if somebody would come in Washington and say, hey, we do not allow to speak English anymore, let's speak only Mexican? Nor Europe, nor America is voicing this development. So, for example, Bandera, this is a person who was a nationalist, who was cooperating with Hitler, and he is provingly, there's no doubt, responsible for killing hundreds of thousands Jews and Polish people in Ukraine. Organized mass murder, was fighting in SS and with Hitler together. He is now the idol in Ukraine. There are now streets called after him. Children are being taught that he's the hero. A hero who killed hundreds of thousands own Ukrainian citizens because they happened to be Jews or had some Polish roots. These people are sitting right now in Ukraine, and neither Europe nor USA, who are both of these governments, brought these people into power, voicing any concern. This is now the repetition what happened 100 years ago in regards to Germany. When I seen this 5 years ago, 2014 happened. In 2015, I was taken by some unseen force, like here, and it brought me to Moscow to be on the Red Square on May 9th to celebrate together with the Russian people the Victory Day. And by the way, the Victory Day, the only other country which celebrates 9 May as a Victory Day World War II is Israel. And interestingly, 1 or 2 years later, Benjamin Netanyahu, with his closest ministers, walked together with Putin on the same place where I was walking, showing support and showing gratitude for the fact that only thanks to the Red Army, Jews were rescued from Holocaust. Without the victory of Red Army against Hitler, there would be no Jews and no Israel today. The attack on Soviet Union was in 1941, and the second front was opened just 44. Still at the end, the Allies were helping, obviously. And they did this even at the beginning of the war. And this is the irony of the situation, that during World War II, on the one side, Americans' industry was helping Hitler, and on the other side, American soldiers still were fighting on the fronts. But the point is, 80% of all combat in World War II was absorbed by Soviet Union. So without Soviet Union, definitely there would be not such an outcome as we had this, thanks God, namely defeating Hitler. So therefore, my point is that due to geopolitical reasons, United States government is creating a belt of countries which are highly Russophobic. It is true for the Baltic states, for Poland, for Romania. They are actively promoting Russophobia against Russians. Obviously, also the Russian community worldwide is affected by this. The fact that even fascism, anti-Semitic worldviews, racism is being used in a big European country to steer some irritation around Russia, to make Russia weaker. It is contrary to what we as a human society, civilization, how we should solve our problems with each other, our conflicts, our competition for resources, which will be there. There is no question about this. I would like to point out that at least in the last century, twice the diplomatic corps of all nations has failed to prevent world wars, twice. Instead of using diplomatic approach, negotiations, flexibility in positions, common sense, instead of this, each country wanted to have its way right. The result was millions, tens of millions of people were killed, lost lives, were displaced. And this was before the nuclear age. World War II was, in the last days of World War II, the nuclear bomb was used on a civil city, by the way, on civilians. The very next couple of days, the US had acquired the nuclear bomb. They immediately used this on an enemy, and there are different views why it was done. But in any case, fact is, if the humanity fails again to solve its controversies in a diplomatic way, we cannot afford to have a third world war. Because as Einstein was asked how the third world war will be fought, he answered, I don't know how the third world war will be fought, but I know how the fourth world war will be fought, namely with sticks and stones. The governments in West especially in Germany, after Germany's history in the last century, I think it is absolutely unacceptable that the recent Bundeskanzler Merkel and her immediate partners and colleagues in political parties is not reacting to these events in Ukraine. It is absolutely unacceptable. What I see day after day in German newspapers like Die Welt, Der Spiegel, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, for me it is incitement against Russia. In Germany it is actually a criminal law. It's called Volksverhetzung, means incitement against other nations. And in my opinion, there is enough ground in Germany that somebody is opening a case against these political forces, which day after day spit on Russia, you can really say this, in an ugly incitement, producing wrong accusations with all these intoxications, which is, in my opinion, invented stories. Things are being shaken up in countries which they consider to be their rivals. And I can only say that the deeds are, in my opinion, aimed not only on weakening, the deeds which are happening now are aimed on destruction of Russia. And this will have grave consequences. The NATO, for sure in conventional terms, is almost 10 times stronger than Russia today. It is not Russia who moved towards the borders of the West and NATO countries. It is NATO who has moved towards east borders despite the promise to Russia that when it went out from Germany and allowed Germany to reunite, by the way, they have promised that NATO will not get closer to borders. Today, NATO is on the borders with Russia. They've taken the approach to take Crimean Peninsula, which is a strategic point, and they are hindering Russia to develop its economical means as any other country. They are risking to place Russia in a position where it will have to react differently than so far. And it is absolutely unacceptable what the German leadership is doing. They should take example of Willy Brandt, who went to Poland and kneeled on his knees and excused for what they did to Poland. Instead of talking to Russia from point of power, the Bundeskanzler Merkel sollte selbst nach Moskau jedes Jahr gehen und auf die Knie vor dem russischen Volk stehen. Für das, was sie getan haben. In the past. In der Vergangenheit. Aber jetzt in dieser Manier mit Russland zu sprechen? Was bilden Sie sich ein? Absolut unverantwortlich gegenüber Ihrem eigenen Volk.
היום ואנו נפרדנו פתאום כל המטפחת קור טוב של נחת תם ונשלם החלום ласковых радостных встреч порой ночной мы повстречались с тобой нежный щеночек, где ты платочек, милый, желанный, родной порой ночной мы повстречались с тобой нежный щеночек, где ты
заглянув в соседний сад, там смуглянка, молдаванка собирает виноград. Я краснею, я бледнею, захотелось вдруг сказать: станем над рекою зорьки летние встречать. Раскудрявый клен зеленый лист резной, я влюбленный, смущенный пред тобой. Клен зеленый, да клен кудрявый, раскудрявый резной.
лес густой.
Раскудрявый клен, зеленый лист резной.
Здесь у клена мы расстанемся с тобой. Клен зеленый, да клен кудрявый, да раскудрявый резной.
Раскудрявый клен, зеленый лист резной. Здесь у клена мы расстанемся с тобой. Клен зеленый, да клен кудрявый, да раскудрявый резной.
Смуглянка, молдаванка по тропинке в лес ушла.
В том обиду я увидел, что с собой не позвала. О смуглянке, молдаванке часто думал по ночам.
Вдруг свою смуглянку я в отряде повстречал.
Раскудрявый клен, зеленый лес резной.
Свою смуглянку он в отряде повстречал. Раскудрявый клен, зеленый лист резной. Здравствуй, парень, мой хороший, мой родной. Клен зеленый, да клен кудрявый, да раскудрявый лесной.
Раскудрявый